Yo, let's go. What's up? It's called a little night streaming. We're going to do a little night streaming. It's called a little night streaming. What's up, y'all? Tonight we're covering Hunter S. Thompson, the infamous Hunter S. Thompson, right? And we are going to be covering Songs of the Doomed. This is Gonzo Papers, Volume 3. What's up, y'all? Shouts out to everybody out there on a weekday night. It's time to settle in, crack open none of the bull tonight, you guys. We're just going to be drinking some good old Coca-Cola, all right? Because we got a late night stream here. We're doing a little night streaming. So shouts out to everybody. Please, before we continue, we wait for everybody to get in here because notification just went off. Yo, thanks everybody for being here again. Tonight we're covering Hunter S. Thompson. Please, thank you, everybody. All my homies always do, but especially if you're watching this later, please take the time to smash that like. Smash that like. Leave me a comment. And so many of y'all are so great about leaving me comments in the algorithm. Please leave me a comment in the algorithm. Thank you for sharing, everybody who shared. And please, of course, hit that subscribe button. Thank you to everybody who watches the streams. And if you're out there watching and you haven't hit that subscribe button, come on now, help me out. Hit that sub button. And of course, my homies, my beautiful mods are dropping the links for how to support me, of course. And that's also in the video description and in the channel description. Cash App, PayPal, Venmo. You can donate to your boy right here and help me to do all kinds of stuff. Get more books, live life, pay for gasoline. We're all trying to make it here. So, I really appreciate your support and everybody who always supports me. Thank you so much. So tonight we're covering Hunter S. Thompson's Songs of the Doomed, right? This is Gonzo Papers, Volume 3. I reread this again today. The last time I read it actually was, I think 20 years ago. It's crazy. So I feel like it was yesterday that I read it. I actually got this book when I first moved to England, and I read it in the fall of that year, but it feels like it was just yesterday. And his writing, his work is so memorable, so easy to remember. That's part of what we're going to be discussing tonight. So many of you may have never heard of this book. Of course, everybody, when they think of Hunter S. Thompson, that's okay. If they think of him at all, they think of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, of course, or they think of the Great Shark Hunt, or they think of Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, or just Rolling Stone magazine, or his columns, or just the movie Fear and Loathing. I mean, there are a number of things that you can think about with Hunter S. Thompson. Some people may not know much of anything about him at all or his writing, and that's okay. If you haven't read Hunter S. Thompson, that's all right. But we're going to be going over it tonight. And hey, maybe this will even save some people. If they don't want to read it, then they can just listen to me discuss it. If you have read it, I suspect that a lot of people watching this have probably read some Hunter S. Thompson, especially the fellas. But this will be a good refresher. And of course, like with everything we do, we're going to be looking at form plus content equals meaning. And Hunter S. Thompson is a controversial figure, by nature, right? So many of us in this sort of community there are certain rumors and things that I can't get into too much. I'll get into them a little bit later. Things that surround the life of Hunter S. Thompson that especially have become relevant in the past few years. And I'm going to address those the best that I can. One of the reasons that I reread the book was because I wanted to see if I could find in the text some evidence or justification in his own writing. Now, part of that's difficult because part of his own writing by nature is, he's a satirical writer, right? And the whole idea of Gonzo journalism is where, just in a nutshell, okay, so Hunter S. Thompson is known as he was a journalist, right? But he sort of invented something called Gonzo journalism, right? Gonzo journalism comes out of the new journalism movement of the latter half of the 20th century, which was sort of invented or characterized by the great writer Tom Wolfe. Tom Wolfe, of course, I've talked about this before. Tom Wolfe went to my school. My my seventh grade English teacher was babysat by Tom Wolfe, which is pretty cool. He wrote The Right Stuff. He wrote the Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. That's, Ken Kesey and all that stuff. He wrote Bonfire of the Vanities. He's a character on his own. We probably need to do some Tom Wolfe. But Gonzo Journalism, and there are blurbs by Tom Wolfe on this book, and he discusses Tom Wolfe. But they diverge. They're completely different writers. And Thompson invented sort of his own thing called Gonzo Journalism, which is essentially, it's where the story by the journalist, the journalist himself inserts himself into the story, and his own telling of the story becomes the story. In other words, this sort of came about when he talks about it in the book, where he was sitting around and someone asked him, I guess at the time he was writing sports columns, and someone asked him like, "Oh, what do where are you from?" And he said, "Louisville, Kentucky." And they said, aren't you covering Churchill Downs? And he said, "No, but that's a good idea." So he went down and he covered the Kentucky Derby, and that became his like major piece, which was, I think, in Rolling Stone, but it was his major like sort of breakthrough piece, where he covered the Kentucky Derby in a gonzo journalistic style, which is essentially to say that he didn't discuss the Kentucky Derby at all, didn't even really cover the race. It was more about the people at the Kentucky Derby and the wild outfits and the hats and the ambiance and the whiskey and the, all the stuff we've come to know about Hunter S. Thompson. That's gonzo journalism, right? Yeah. So thank you, Maddie says, was in Scanlon's monthly. Thank you so much, Maddie. So that became sort of the centerpiece of what Hunter S. Thompson and his writing became. Now we're going to talk about his thoughts on writing and what writing means, for the life of the writer. We're going to, he especially is he's got a lot of great pieces and a lot of great passages on the difference between journalism and fiction writing, or journalism and real writing. And I think those are revelatory. Just, not something so specific, like just for the writers, those of us who are writers, but something that's more wide, that appeals to a wider audience, or even to the culture itself, because this gets at the importance or non-importance of journalism or reporting, especially in the life of the world today, and especially during the great RESET. I've said before that when we talk about artistic movements and Thompson will go into that. He will discuss the idea that like the decade is kind of a ridiculous a marker for how to determine culture or art or life. And that he says that the Australians and the New Zealanders think longer. They think in terms of 20 years. He throws out strange comparisons, but that are funny. But anyway, he basically says that like the life of a political generation is about 20 years. At one point he says that. And for the purposes of like determining an artistic movement, I've discussed before, like what determines an artistic movement or era or epoch, right? And I've mentioned before that, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it reminds me of, I know nothing about physics, but I do know that, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, all that mess. Well, it's sort of the same in terms of artistic and political movements, right? Because you'll have one movement, a swing of the, I guess, proverbial pendulum in one direction, and then you will have an immediate reactionary movement against that. So, for example, the post-World War II, booming golden age of America economy with, the white picket fence, the two houses, and the car, and the dog, and all that stuff, right? And then you have the reaction, which would be the boomers and the hippie generation, which is like the long hair and then the wild music and all that stuff. Now, of course, there's a lot to that. We know that a lot of that is culture creation and social engineering and all that stuff. But just suffice it to say that tends to be the trend in terms of artistic movements, right? We saw that when we discussed the neoclassical era and then the British Romantic era. We saw it with the British Romantic era going into the Victorian era. And we can say that artistic, in terms of literature especially, the Victorian era, again, is like 1837 and 1901. It's the life of the reign of Queen Victoria, which is, sort of characterized by colonialism and the Pax Britannica and all this stuff. And then we have 1901, the death of Queen Victoria, and the start of the modernist era. And most people will characterize the modern era or modernity. We've discussed this before, T.S. Eliot, etc. Modernity essentially is the different, the amount of progress that occurred between 1901 and 1969 is essentially characterized by the fact that in 1901 we have bare bones, mechanization of cars. We've got the Industrial Revolution, but people still basically didn't go outside of their village, their town, or cities in America were starting to pop up. And they traveled essentially by horseback, or some basic automobile. But in 68 years, we went to so-called walking on the moon, right? But the modern era is essentially 1901 through the present. I would say that the modern era sort of ends with the dropping of the A-bomb in 1945, and then we have the postmodern era. That's not like a hot take. That's a lot of people have kind of come to accept that. And then I would say 1945 to 2001 would sort of be the postmodern era. 2001 we have the age of terror, the war on terror. And then, of course, now with 2020 and so forth, we have the great reset, right? Now, the reason I'm saying all that is because Hunter S. Thompson is really, it's funny reading him now. The last time I read him was 2002. And it's funny reading him now for some perspective, because we see that he wrote for like 5 decades, and he died in 2005. He didn't really write in the 2000s, but he certainly presaged the age of the war on terror, which I'm going to get to in one of the passages in here, with the bombing of the Lebanese embassy, and his thoughts on Bush Sr. and Reagan, etc. And his writing is it's not obsolete, and it's not just nostalgic or a time capsule, but it's certainly again, like, presages the war on terror, and even some parts of what we have now in terms of the precursors with the social dynamics of the 60s, etc. And it's one thing that I found funny was that when he's talking about, for instance, he's talking one part about when he went to Texas, and he refers to boomers, but he's not actually referring to boomers like we refer to them. He's referring to like boom towns. So, I mean, it's interesting that, Hunter S. Thompson is sort of a pre-boomer. I mean, he was born in 1937, and he wrote he started writing like in the 50s. And of course, he's known for his writing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then the 80s. And then he calls the 90s. He says, "Welcome to the 90s. Welcome to jail," he says. Now, of course, Hunter S. Thompson was an uber, lefty, right? But one thing that I would say is that his thoughts about, for instance, I mean, he was personal friends with Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter and all these people. And when the book begins actually with him getting in trouble. I don't know if you know this, but he was charges were brought against him for assault against a prawn so-called filmmaker. And these were real charges. This was a big event in his life, and they were ultimately dismissed. But my question is, were they ultimately dismissed at the behest of his rich and powerful friends? Because he did have them. And one thing that's unusual is one of my sort of thesis statement with this would be that Hunter S. Thompson represents, in the mind of the popular consciousness, especially older people, or even people our age and younger, who read Hunter S. Thompson. I mean, pretty much every young man, it's like a rite of passage to read Hunter S. Thompson and the Beat Generation, right? That's a thing, and that's fine. That's cool. We all did that. But I think that one thing that comes with age is discernment, and you start to question the surroundings of his writer, of his writing, the meaning of it, right, and what it means in context. And of course, one of the reasons that, he wrote a lot for shock value. But the question becomes, when you're younger, you're reading it and you're saying to yourself, oh, he's writing all this shocking material, and you can see the establishment getting, shocked by his truly Thompson-esque language. But then as you get older, not that you get more, prudish, or, you get that older thing. Oh, the young people. One thing that you get is you think, how much of this is shock value that is based on truth? In other words, it's kind of like a satire that doubles back on itself. And one of the points of satire, right, is that, satire differs from parody, because parody is meant to be simply imitation, sort of for fun, right? Satire is meant to be imitation, biting imitation with the purpose of reform or truth. And a lot of times, we live in an age where we're living like the golden age of satire, right? With meme warfare. And I think that satire can oftentimes reveals more truth about a situation than the so-called facts or the reality, because we don't know what we can trust, especially in the age of internet information and widespread, what they refer to as disinfo, right, is oftentimes truthful, and the real disinfo is the spread of truth under the guise of, or disinfo under the guise of truth, if that makes sense. And I think that with Thompson, I would say that a lot of times the shock value is questionable in terms of what are these things actually true? And it's up to us to have discernment. Now, like I said, going through this book, and also you guys probably haven't heard of this book. You may have, but I've got all of Hunter S. Thompson's books. I've got The Great Shark Hunt, 2 copies of Fear and Loathing up there. I've got 2 copies of Hell's Angels. I've got Generation of Swine, Rum Diary, all of his books. But one thing that you probably haven't heard of is this biography by E. Jean Carroll called Hunter, The Strange and Savage Life of Hunter S. Thompson. Now, this book was written by one of the female Gonzo journalists who sort of follows Hunter S. Thompson, writes it in the style of sort of almost newspaper excerpts, right? The paragraphs become sort of excerpts and interviews from various people about Hunter S. Thompson. She was with him and, followed him. And so the question becomes, is this biography or like para-biography? How much of it is satire? But one of the things in this book that disturbed me when I read it is the amount of time spent on the things that we've come to know or think about Hunter S. Thompson involving prawn and 9mm stuff, if you know what I'm talking about. And I can't really say more than that because it's too spicy, but I will say, if you're interested, you can still look on YouTube. I just checked before this and the interviews are still up. And I would check after the stream and look at the interviews with Rusty Nelson. Now, who knows about whether this guy is a schizoid or telling the truth, but he was a so-called photographer during the Franklin, SCANDAL, the Franklin thing, the event that occurred, with Franklin. What's his name? What's the guy's name who was on AJ? And he was part of the Phoenix program. He did the interviews. He wrote the book on the Franklin scandal. And what's his name? John, I can't remember his name. Anyway, so the question becomes whether that is true or not. And in his interviews, he discusses how actually Hunter S. Thompson served as an agent of these people making 9mm films. Okay. And I tend to think that there's no evidence, right? Except for here's, his word of mouth. But I tend to think that may be true. Simply because when you look at his lifestyle and how he afforded to, how he could afford, John DeCamp, thank you, Kristen, how he could afford to do this lifestyle, living on the sort of whims of his publishers. I mean, he writes like, column articles for Rolling Stone, etc. So I don't know, maybe that's affordable. Maybe he lived that way and that was all legit. I don't know. But that combined with his activities, what he writes about, and and all of the people with whom, in his circle make me, I don't know, kind of suspicious. Right. So, if you, for further look into that, I would check out this book, but I'm going to mainly be talking about, of course, Songs of the Doomed. And there is some, there are some passages in this that deal with that. Right. So let's begin. Let's see. The book begins with, in typical like flair, his flair for writing and the absurd and the dramatic. It begins with a fake publisher's note, and it's kind of funny because the publisher's note reminds me of the comments section in my own videos. Because okay, here's what the publisher's note says: the author has asked that the publisher contribute a note to this latest work. This is it. Thanks, Doc. In other words, it's like, please leave a comment. And the comment is comment, right? And I think that's kind of cool. Hunter S. Thompson would have been, really, I think he would have been really good as a, I don't know, as a shit poster, as a guy doing memes, because a lot of his writing is like that. It's, of course it takes a longer form and it's satirical, but the sense of like melodrama, right, is inherent in his writing. That's what makes it exciting. He says that he's got a dedication. Then he's got, the contents are basically, they're excerpts from various books and various columns. So like, for instance, there are excerpts from his book on the Hells Angels. Remember, Hunter S. Thompson, like another one of his big breakthroughs was his Hells Angels book. He followed, he wrote an article. He mentioned the Hells Angels, and then one of them like heard about it and saw it, and then he knew Ken Kesey, right, from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and the acid tests, and then he organized a party between the Merry Pranksters and invited the Hells Angels, and then like he basically supplied them with drugs for the party, and then of course, so then the Hells Angels, like, they dug this. They thought he was legit. They ended up not thinking he was legit and famously beat him up really bad and left him in the trunk of a car. Who knows? Maybe because they found out what he was up to, or maybe they just thought he was a square. Who knows? But there are excerpts from the Hells Angels book. And of course, Hunter S. Thompson was one of the people that popularized the Hells Angels in the mind of the establishment, I guess, or the normies of the time. Jethro. So I think that one of the other questions as we read this, or as we go through this and analyze, will be the idea of what constitutes the counterculture and what constitutes the establishment. Of course, Hunter S. Thompson, people think of him, I was going to say this earlier, people think of him as the counterculture figure or writer, right? Especially from like the 60s on. Oh, what a rebel, right? But he even says at one point that he was writing for Rolling Stone all this time, and then Rolling Stone, he says that Jan Winter of Rolling Stone, basically sold out to the advertisers and to the business guys in New York, and that when that happened, they became an establishment magazine. They were no longer a counterculture magazine. I mean, even if they were a counterculture magazine from the beginning, I'm sure it was mostly a socially engineered, almost like a Tavistock or an Esalen Institute publication, right? And I think that really the only, we can see now that it's like the true counterculture, right, would be, those who the counterculture now is one that is so oppressed, right, by the establishment. They're so beaten down. They're rooted out, and they are destroyed. So one has to be self-published, right? One can barely be on a major platform. And, one still has to play the game in a way, but, we can see that, like, we live in this age of, censorship and all that more than any other era. And that it's so much more devious because it's like we live under the guise of there being no censorship and that, everything's free, and that the establishment thinks they are the counterculture when in fact they are the establishment. Right. Yes, Jerry says true counterculture is traditional Christianity. Totally agree with you. I'm going to read some excerpts from a couple of excerpts here. One, which will interest you probably the most, is called Vegas Witchcraft, which includes the famous passage from Fear and Loathing. Good. Hopefully my volume is good. I see it's kind of freezing up a little bit, so bear with me, you guys. I'm also going to read from the 60s, the thing on the 60s where it's the passage on the high watermark, which I've talked about before. That also I realized is taken from, what's up, TGF? Everybody go to TGF, the Green Feathers, and check out his painting, you guys. The guy is a master painter. I mean, really awesome work, TGF. I was stunned. Yeah, TGF and his wife on there doing live streams of painting. That was really cool. And let's see. I was saying the high watermark, which I've talked about before, the crest of a high and beautiful wave. And one thing, again, this idea of intertextuality is that we see how much in this book, how much The Great Gatsby influenced, in terms of its diction, and then go back to my Jeff Stein-Effrey Great Gatsby stream if you haven't seen that. I'm also going to read about some of his political writing, especially when he writes about the war on terror and Gaddafi, which is pretty revelatory, pretty interesting. And Ken Kesey, LSD, etc. And then some passages on writing. So let's see. This begins with an editor's note. I'm only going to read the editor's note because it sort of sets the theme for the rest of the book, and I think it's important to read. It says, shortly before this book went to press, we were stunned and profoundly demoralized by a news bulletin out of Aspen. Of course, Hunter S. Thompson lived in Aspen, in this place called Woody Creek. All Thompson fans or readers will know that. Lived in Woody Creek, Colorado, which is also interesting. He had a huge plot of land. How can he get all this? And that Dr. charges of brutal sex and violence. Initial reports were hazy and incoherent. Sorry. But Thompson's alleged attorney told reporters and many others, which means he could go to state prison for at least 16 years. One director, or whatever she was, accused him of assaulting her, like throwing a margarita in her face and physically assaulting her. And then that when they searched the place, of course, they found acid, they found diazepam, Valium, they found various pills, they found marijuana, cocaine, dynamite, weapons, and they found a videotape. Now, can you guess what the videotape said? Well, they were quick to dismiss it, but they found a videotape in plain sight at Hunter S. Thompson's, compound house, Woody Creek, which was labeled, I'm not going to say the words, but CP. They said that they did a brief investigation and that they found the contents of it were. Now, does that? Okay, I get that he was an edgy guy, but it's not cool. That's not. Hold on. Connection unstable. Give me a second. Hopefully the volume is still good. Hopefully my audio is still good. It's probably because of the time of night that we're streaming here. Yeah, so I get that he thought he was edgy and all this stuff, but I don't know anybody that would even that's not a joke. Okay. That's not a joke. It's not, I don't know. I'm not going to do any justice to it by saying how fucking weird and that is, and how, that's very suspicious, right? I mean, that if the things that people say that I can't mention here are true, that seems like it would corroborate them. And it doesn't help that, the people in, the sheriff's department, right, found it and they dismissed it. It's like, well, we just said in the last stream, right? Remember we did the Spiderhead stream and we just talked about how the people that do this and the people that control these things, police, that's no matter. They buy off these people. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But I think that's, I think that's revelatory. Now, that combined with this book that I just showed you, combined with what other people have said, of course it's hearsay, but what other people have said is that he did way more. He did way more than just have a tape. The rumor is that he made the tapes, and that not just that he made the tapes, but that other things were involved with that, and that they were for groups of people. We're talking 9mm territory. Now, I'm not trying to get too dark here, okay? But we're talking about this guy in this book, so I think it's important to mention, right? Yes, Kristen says, why do you think he was such an alcoholic druggie? I mean, exactly. I think now, of course, we can come up with justifications for that. He's a wild writer and all that. Maybe that's the case. However, I don't know. Maybe that was to an anodyne. Maybe that was to cover up his activities. I don't know. But yeah, okay. Moving away from that, it says, okay. So the epigraph to this book, which also doesn't help you guys, is from a poet named George Barker, who was one of the so-called new apocalyptics in the 20th century. And this is from his so-called Sacred Elegy 5. Okay, here we go. Here's the epigraph. Fiend behind the fiend, behind the fiend, behind the fiend. Mastodon with mastery, monster with an ache. At the tooth of the ego, the dead drunk judge. Wheresoever thou art, our agony will find thee enthroned on the darkest altar of our heartbreak. Perfect, beast, brute, bastard, oh dog, my God. All right, so there you go with the blasphemous epigraph, which on analysis would only seem to vindicate what I just said, or at least what I'm hinting at in terms of him. I mean, listen, he talks blatantly about beast-eality in this book. And again, it's one of the shocking things that he jokes about, which is in the book also kind of dismissed as, oh no, it's incredible. That's just him being Hunter S. Thompson being Hunter S. Thompson. Why does he bring up this stuff so much, man? That's one of the things I'm talking about with age and discernment. You read this when you're younger, I guess, and you're just like, oh no, man, it's just shocking. I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. But now you read it and you go, who talks about this stuff, man? So, okay, let's talk about some of the literary elements to get away from that. On page 30 and 31, this is called Last Train from Camelot. It says, October is the cruelest month of any election year. He's constantly, he is literary. I mean, he's always making allusions. Of course, that's the T.S. Eliot illusion, right? April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. But by then, the pain is so great that even the strong are like jelly, and time has lost all meaning for anybody still involved in a political campaign. By that time, even candidates running unopposed have abandoned all hope of victory. Dante, right? We just read Dante. And live only for the day when they will finally be free to seek vengeance on all those treacherous bastards who once passed themselves off as loyal friends and allies and swore they were only in it because they all shared the same hopes and dreams. Talking about political campaigns. Remember, Hunter S. Thompson himself, he ran a political campaign, right? He ran for sheriff of Aspen, and he has his own political aspirations. But again, part of my thesis is that Hunter S. Thompson isn't like just some critic of politics or a policy wonk. I hate that expression. They always say, have you ever noticed how, I can't remember the last time I watched MSM, but they always they'll say like, oh, Janet Reno was a policy wonk. I hate that term. oh, she's so cool. These people are so cool because they know all the ins and outs of DC and they know all the policy, right? So they try to pass off Hunter S. Thompson as this, as one of those guys. But instead, I tend to think that he's a political operative, right? Um, he sort of has all the hallmarks of controlled opposition. I mean, if you guys ever seen Black Mirror, remember that Black Mirror episode 1 is actually based on Hunter S. Thompson political operation that he ran. I don't know if you guys know that. Remember that Black Mirror episode 1 is about a guy running for office, and there's a vicious rumor that he had relations with a PIG pig, right? And that they say that that's based off something that like related to David Cameron, but it's actually the origin of it, as far as I know, is actually based on Hunter S. Thompson, because he says in the book, he says blatantly, like, they were running against somebody was running for office, and he was sort of functioning as a sort of a para, not even a direct consultant, but sort of a para consultant, sort of a dark political operative. And one of the things he suggested was, let's just say that the guy had sex with a PIG. And the guy, I forget who it was, but the guy said, well, we can't say that. It's not true. And he said, no, I'm not saying. He says, I'm not saying that we're saying it's true. We're not going to say that it's true. We're going to say there's a rumor that it happened, right? Which is so devious. We're going to put that out there that it's a rumor. That way we don't even have to confirm or deny. All we know is that we heard the rumor. But what it accomplished was, by putting it out there as a rumor that this candidate had sex with a PIG, it put into the minds of the readers and in the minds of the audience that this is the case. And we know that with politics and with real politic, right, that people are so get so bent out of shape with rumors. They themselves will know that it's a rumor, but they will promote it as the truth. I mean, this happens every day in every political campaign, in every conversation out there in the world, in every news story, that you know very well that this person didn't do whatever it is. Name the thing, right? But it doesn't matter, because your political affiliations are so poisoned by the fact that, the other side, right, whatever the other side is more poisonous, right? The lesser of two evils, as they say, whatever. They're both evil. So that was based on a thing Hunter S. Thompson did. Thank you for those super chats I just saw come in, PayPal, and I think there was a Cash App. I'll get to those in a minute. Thank you so much for donating, you guys. I appreciate you. This says, October in the politics business is like drowning in scum or trying to hang on through the final hour of a bastinado punishment. The flesh is dying and the heart is full of hate. The winners are subpoenaed by divorce lawyers, and the losers hole up in cheap motel rooms on the outskirts of town with a briefcase full of hypodermic needles and the certain knowledge that the next time their names get in the newspapers will be when they're found dead and naked in a puddle of blood in the trunk of some filthy stolen car in an abandoned parking lot. Now, that, again, is satire, but it's true. The truth of it is more true than the factual reality. You can't, in other words, you can't say, oh, we're going to, no, somebody will, the rebuttal will be, oh, no, not all politicians are like that when they lose. Well, of course, not all. But the fact is that is their character. These people are scum. That's the character. And one example I would say of that would be, look at the Sedantis, Governor Sedantis of Florida, right? And the guy he ran against. You remember all that happened in Florida? That is literally what they found with the guy that he ran against. Do you remember that a few years ago? It says, let's see. There's a memo from Skinner. A lot of times his memos and stuff are just him. They're just written from him, right? It says, let's see. I didn't even feel it when she bit me in the face. Hell, that was nothing. This time I saw the devil and it scared the shit out of me. He tried to get his hands on my throat, but I kept stabbing him. And then I saw all those people running out of the White House and screaming about murder. I thought they'd killed 41? But it turned out that Bush had murdered Quayle, shot him with a Luger. It's a dream he had with a Luger. Says, yeah, he said Quayle was stealing from him. He just stepped back and shot him 9 times in the stomach and then gouged out one of his eyes while he was dying. November has finally come, and the fat lady's about to sing for a lot of people who call it a hateful noise, even though they always swore they love music. The campaign is over unless somebody gets assassinated, and even that probably wouldn't make much difference. No riots would erupt if any of the others were croaked. You can't miss what you never had. That's from 1988. Okay, so let's see. This is a note from Ralph Steadman. Ralph Steadman is a famous English artist who was one of his sort of sidekicks. He did all the artwork for Fear and Loathing, and he's got references to King Lear in here. He says, Hunter S. Thompson does not suffer fools gladly. In fact, I have reason to believe I'm the only fool who's indulged like a twin in all his life. But that is a long another story. All kings need their fool. King Lear's fool was his wisdom, finally his vision. We need to cover King Lear. Hunter has both in full measure and needs neither fool nor pretender to forge his destiny and maybe ours. It says, it was I who raged against the coming of the light, Dylan Thomas reference. We've done Dylan Thomas. In Miami at the Watergate hearings. It was I who knew for certain that America was sick at heart. And it was I who discovered the dark legend of Hawaii through Robert Huff's book of Captain Cook's Voyage and realized that Hunter may be the reincarnation of Lano. The god returned after 1,500 years of wandering like a lovesick child to save his people and his beloved American Constitution. Make no mistake about that, for he is your savior and he is guardian of all you profess to hold dear. In his weirdness, he illuminates the faults of your reason and etches the silhouettes of your antics against a pure white background like Balinese shadow puppets. So he's saying that's the purpose of Hunter S. Thompson, right? Now, one of the things that critics and his friends will often state about Thompson is that the reason for his depravity and degradation is that the people that he covers are depraved. So he needs to sort of get down in the muck with them and be worse than them, because by being worse than them, he will illuminate their own faults, which is a fairly, it was a fairly Gnostic outlook, right? And then he quotes from Gnostic in terms of, right, songs of innocence and experience, William Blake, and the idea of illumination through, crossing the abyss. He quotes Gatsby, and he says, this is sort of his statement on America. He says, as the moon rose higher, the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the new world, its vanished trees. The trees that had made way for Gatsby's house had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. For a transitory, enchanted moment, man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. All right, so keep that in mind. And now I'm going to read an excerpt from The High Watermark. And let's see, this is, page 140 in the book. So on page 140, this is one of his most famous passages. It's from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I'm an island boy. He says, strange memories on this nervous night in Vegas. 5 years later, 6, it seems like a lifetime, or at least the main era. Page 141. The kind of peak that never comes again. San Francisco in the middle 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. Maybe it meant something, maybe not in the long run, but no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of the time in the world, whatever it meant. So we're reading a lyrical interpretation of life in the mid 60s, right? At least this stands for people who were there at the time and their experience. We can also look at this in the context of, for instance, McGowan, right? Don't worry, Kristen, I won't sing it again. McGowan, McGowan's weird scenes inside the canyon, right, and culture creation. He says history is hard to know because all the hired bullshit. Well, that's true, right? History is hard to know because of all the hired bullshit, right? History is written by the winners. Okay, yeah, simplistic statement, but history is, we see how people get unpersoned now, right? We see how things change from day to day now, and we have this sort of news speak and the idea of unpersoning people. But I mean, who's to say that didn't happen for everything in terms of the historical events of the past and their the political context, right? But even without being sure of history, it seems entirely reasonable to think that every now and then, at least we're talking post Enlightenment, at least, right? It is entirely reasonable to think that every now and then the energy of a whole generation comes to a head in a long line flash for reasons that nobody really understands at the time and which never explain in retrospect what actually happens. He says there was madness in any direction at any hour. If not across the bay, then up the Golden Gate or down 101 to Los Altos or La Honda. You could strike sparks anywhere. There was a fantastic universal sense that whatever we were doing was right, that we were winning. And that, I think, was the handle. That sense of inevitable victory over the forces of old and evil. Not in any mean or military sense. We didn't need that. Our energy would simply prevail. There was no point in fighting on our side or theirs. We had all the momentum. We were riding the crest of a high and beautiful wave. So now, less than 5 years later, you could go up on a steep hill in Las Vegas and look west. And with the right kind of eyes, you could almost see the high water mark, that place where the wave finally broke and rolled back. Now, yeah, that's directly a Fitzgerald passage, right? I mean, that's almost pure Fitzgerald. That's almost pure Gatsby. But I would say that it's a beautiful passage. It's lyrically beautiful and true in many senses. However, what he's saying there is delusional in a way, because he's sort of still working, as we all would in America. He's working under this paradigm of like the American dream and and manifest destiny and going out into the. I mean, we've talked about this before. Imagine going into the continent. You come from Europe, you go into the continent, and you get like in a wagon, and you go out into the unknown. You go out into the great unknown. You head west, right? And I heard one time, just as a side note, I think it was my AP English teacher was discussing why football and soccer are the way that they are, because you would think that. So they're sort of contradictory. Okay, why is football the American, the archetype? Why is it the sport? Well, because the field, the gridiron, the field is determined by yardage, and the game itself is sort of slow going for the most. I mean, this is why an hour-long football game will last 4 hours, right? And it's determined by slow going, first down, second down, right? And you're running. And then occasionally you get a Hail Mary, but it's like slow and incremental. And the reason why this is not popular in other parts of the world is because it represents the purely American experience. It represents starting on the East Coast, right? And going right to left and slowly making progress across the continent until you get to the other coast, right? Where all sorts of things can happen to you. The battles, the travails, the weather, the trials and tribulations. Whereas soccer, which is a much faster game, right? And is a continuous and it has a continuity to it, right? Which you would think Americans would dig that game more because of the speed. But in fact, we don't, because I mean, I'm not saying people don't like soccer, but I'm saying it represents more of a European experience because it's sort of a huge pitch or a huge field with everybody sort of all at once going in every direction and sometimes going in specific directions, just like the wars of conquest or the the European wars. Does that make sense? Now it's probably a pretty esoteric explanation, and you may think, okay, that's total bullshit, but that tends to that sort of tends in a poetic way to like encapsulate those two games as like our national sports. And I think that back to this passage, I think that this passage represents a purely American experience and just how The Great Gatsby does, right? But again, in context, I mean, even Thompson will later he'll later say himself that I think later on he says that in the 70s he realized like Nixon was he says Nixon was their Gatsby, but instead of at the end of a long dock, instead of a green light, it was black light, right? And that Nixon represented the we'll get to that in a second, but but anyway, he says, remember all of Thompson is tempered by politics, right? Which is why he's more than just a political a political commentary, culture writer. He tends to me to be more of an actual political operative, right? He says, there's a passage here about Muskie, and when he was working on against the Muskie campaign, and he says, I never said that this deals with ibogaine rather than with the pig, but he says, I never said that Muskie was taking ibogaine. I said there was a rumor in Milwaukee that a strange Brazilian doctor had been showing up at his suite to administer heavy shots of some strange drug called ibogaine. Of course, it wasn't true. I never said it was true. I said there was a rumor to that effect. I made up the rumor. Right. So he says, see, I didn't realize until about halfway through the campaign that people believed this stuff. I assumed that like the people I was around and like myself, they were getting their primary coverage of the campaign from newspapers, television, radio, and the traditional media. He says, I think that people took it seriously because politics, particularly presidential campaigns and the president and the White House, have always been sacred cows in this country, almost as if the president ruled by some divine right, especially since the start of the age of television. Some people have that kind of respect for these people. I don't, any more than I have respect for police and chambers of commerce. I have respect for quite a few things, quite a few people. Politicians just don't happen to be among them. Just because a person can subject himself to the degradations of a lifetime in politics and finally end up in the White House is certainly no reason to respect him, as Nixon has recently given us elegant evidence to confirm. Yeah, and then he says, some of the things I called Nixon obviously were not accurate. Nixon does not, as far as I know, fuck pigs and sell used cars with cracked blocks. Nor is he corrupt beyond the ability of modern man to describe it. Those are exaggerations to make a point. My concern with accuracy is on a higher level than nickels and dimes, in a word, line by line. No, it was pretty interesting, right? And then he gives the actual article that he wrote. Ed Muskie doomed by ibogaine, bizarre drug plot revealed. Right. Okay. Then he says, so on page 147, he talks about how he's in a political bar in DC. And he says he heard about the South China Sea needs to be taught a lesson by the U.S. Marines for not showing the proper respect for God and the American eagle. And then he goes on to say that he predicts that Kissinger, he says what America needs to do. He proposed an outlandish scenario for an American invasion of the oil fields with Russia, making a deal with the Russians and just seizing the oil. I said, this is what Kissinger would do. I was proposing it in the same kind of tongue-in-cheek style of the ibogaine thing. I didn't say that I'd heard Kissinger was planning this or that I had some inside information. I just proposed it as a likelihood for the coming year. Several days later, the Times got a letter from one of the Arab embassies denouncing them for this incredible kind of incendiary irresponsibility. And then it wasn't 7 months before Kissinger himself proposed this, as well as Ford, and the idea of invading the Middle East to seize the Arab oil became a definite policy in the energy crisis. Do you see how life, right, reflects art, or at least how? So what he's saying here is that, like, he proposed it as a joke. It's completely outlandish at the time, right? Oh, we've run out of oil. What we need to do is partner with Russia, and we need to invade the Arab oil fields. Because remember, at the time, I mean, I've got this book on the House of Getty, and I think that it's one thing that's amazing and to keep in mind. I mean, we just read Moby Dick, right, where we talk about in the 19th century, oil and oil lamps ran on whale oil, right? And then all of a sudden, basically in the late 19th and early 20th century, then oil is discovered. And now the entire world runs on the blood of the earth, right? Or the oil, the crushed dinobots or whatever now, but runs on oil. And it wasn't until much later that even Getty, I think Getty was the guy who was responsible for saying, hey, look, we need to test out there in the sand dunes in the deserts because they probably have oil. I mean, Jay recently was just talking about, it was Kim Philby's dad. Remember Kim Philby, the Cambridge spy ring? Kim Philby's dad, working for the globalists and for the British establishment, the government, went over there, converted to Islam, and set up the deal, right, between the and what became the oil companies. And Getty did it too. Getty did it on a grand scale. He went over and he said, look, we'll get a little bit that they gave the the Saudi oil sheikhs, etc., have provided them with the most fabulous wealth the world has ever seen. But that is nothing compared to what later on he talks about. One of his big things is he talks about Gaddafi in a little bit. I think my video is kind of freezing or going in and out, but it should be good. Before I get to the Gaddafi part, why don't I mention I'll read some of his thoughts on writing. He talks about how he felt when the Beat Generation occurred. His thoughts on, he says, this is pretty revelatory and this is good. He says on page 64, this is in the section fleeing New York from, was writing about the 50s. He says, thank you guys. He says columns for newspaper, shitty little restaurant or whatever. He ended up insulting Joe Gallo, and that he was called in front of the editor, and the editor said, you have to apologize and for this pasta. And he said, he essentially said, no, I'm not going to apologize for that. Who gives a shit? And then he realized basically that, and he realized this later with Rolling Stone, that, it wasn't the editors or the content that determined the medium or the truth. It was how they were beholden to this, essentially the special interests, right? They're beholden to the advertisers. Now it would be data and black budget data and MIC, but back then it was essentially to mafia territory, etc. And he says, I couldn't get the damn, let's see. He says, after 4 or 5 days later, I went out of the newsroom to a candy machine back behind the composing room. I wanted a candy bar. I put a nickel in the machine and nothing happened. I pulled the thing. Nothing came out. I put another nickel in, pulled the handle. Nothing came out. I stepped back to give it a boot. You smack things and coins drop. Instead, the whole bottom of the machine gave way. The bottom was where they kept all the storage stuff underneath. The guy just doesn't come around and fill the candy machines with a sack. When he comes in, he replaces the stock, moves the candy bars up into the rack from underneath. So I couldn't get the damn metal panel back in the machine. I kicked it very hard and sprung it out. I couldn't get it back in, so I propped it up and thought nothing more about it. I just took 2 candy bars out of the bottom, which I'd paid for, and put the tin piece back in there. It looked almost right. Somehow someone figured out that it wasn't quite right, and the people in the composing room stole the candy bars and ate them naturally free. I didn't think that anybody else knew that the whole bottom was full of candy bars. So I go in the next day and I get fired, and they dock my pay for all those candy bars. And I had to pay something like $17.85 for 350 candy bars, something like that. That was when I gave up on journalism completely. They hadn't hassled me at all about my copy, but they hassled me a lot about my personal attitude. The fact I would take my shoes off in the winter. Wet shoes, of course, you take them off. No, I never got into trouble about the work I did. It was always about personal relations with people. So I moved into a deep cabin in the hills about 20 miles out of Middletown. I couldn't afford heat, so I would turn the heat way down until my hands got too cold to work, and then I'd go to sleep. The next day, I'd work again and get in about 3 hours at night. I was just living off unemployment and driving a huge black Jaguar Mark 7, was writing short stories. Seems like I have a long history of constantly retreating from journalism to fiction, which is the exact opposite of the traditional American writer, where the noble novelist is continually forced to rejection and ignorance and money pressure to resort to journalism. So in other words, what he said, I thought this was a revelatory passage because all the shit about like the candy bar in the machine, it to me is symbolic. I mean, I can you guys relate to this? What he's saying here is that on the one hand, part of being a grown ass man or part of being an adult is, you have to get along with people. Everybody knows that. It's how you talk to people. It's how you treat people. You have to get along with people. You have to, you don't want to make waves and all that stuff. But the other side of it, which almost outweighs it, is there comes a point where like, if you're good at something or you're really good at something, oftentimes the forces of mediocrity, right, will bring you down. They will do everything they can to bring you down, right? Ezra Pound says, better mendacities than the classics and paraphrase. In other words, you do it right. You do it the way it's supposed to be. And oftentimes people who are really good at something or visionaries, right, are broken down, right, because of the mediocre forces of idiocy around them, right? It's like when let's say you're really good at, let's say you're really good at being a lawyer or being an accountant or something, or working in an office. And you go in and you do your job better than everybody else. You are the best. You have the most output. And that will get you a lot in life. It'll get you very far. People will recognize your talents and your creativity, but they will not stop you from making you go to meetings, right? And they'll make you go to the meeting about the meeting. And they'll make you go to the meeting that will plan the meeting that will be about the meeting. In other words, you have to do this bullshit. And eventually, if you don't play the game, then that's it. And that's what he's saying here. And in fact, his, name the writer, right? We've discussed how Poe was the first American writer to make his, he was the first American to make a living purely as a writer. And that killed him. I mean, he died at 40. Like he just could not survive doing that. He was sometimes, he would write for newspapers. He would write reviews of other people's poems. But even then he was called the hatchet man, right? He just had no time for bullshit and bad writing, right? And that eventually killed him. He couldn't make a living. And can you name one great writer living now, who makes his living purely as a writer? Of course, you've got the establishment writers and you got the people that are sponsored by the major publishing houses and all those people. And there aren't very many of them, right? But almost every writer, even the writers we've covered here, right? Seamus Heaney, Nobel Prize winner, still had to make a living teaching creative writing classes at Harvard. We've studied Yusef Komunyakaa, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, still has to teach creative writing classes at Princeton, et cetera. Now, those are prestigious positions, but they still are teaching. Like you can't be a writer without making your living as your ends meet as a teacher, right? Now I don't know what the solution to that is. I don't know what that means, but what I'm saying is that this is often the case. And that with Hunter S. Thompson, one of the things he says is that his actual route was the opposite, right? He actually, instead of retreating, like instead of writing and making his living as a journalist, he was actually making his living as a journalist first. And that made him retreat into fiction writing. And that's an interesting take, because from that allows him to like really, learn his voice as a writer, which is essentially journalistic writing or under the guise of being a journalist, but writing pretty much pure fiction or at least satire, right? So then I think there are a few passages like that. One other one is, see if I can find the other one since I'm talking about it. Let's see. Yeah, on writing on page 181. So another example is the energy of writing, right? Or the energy of any kind of endeavor. He says he essentially compares it to the Hells Angels. He says, I managed by using almost any kind of valid or invalid journalistic credentials I get my hands on to get myself personally involved in just about everything that interested me, from Berkeley to Chicago, Las Vegas to the White House, shark fishing, street fighting, dope smuggling, Hells Angels, Super Bowls, local politics, a few things I prefer not to mention until various statutes of limitations expire. What is that? What's he talking about there, right? Well, I don't know. We could speculate, but I would say that probably involves, that also involves his supplemental income, or at least maybe that was his main income, right? Working as an operative in these dark things. But he says, indeed, those were good years for almost any kind of journalism. It was the main language of a very public and political decade. But I suspect it will not be the main language of the 1970s, or at least not for me and most of the people I know. Very few of them subscribe to the same papers or newspaper or magazines now that they subscribe to 5 or even 2 years ago. And even fewer plan to vote in the 76 general election. Not even the best and most perceptive journalists covering the presidential campaign even care who will win it or why. And neither do I, for that matter. After 10 years of the most intense kind of personal and professional involvement in national politics, it occurs to me now that I could have left it all alone, except for my role as a journalist and all the constant action it plunged me into. My life would not have been much different, regardless of who won or lost any one of the myriad clashes, causes, confrontations, elections, brawls, chases, or other high adrenaline situations that I found myself drawn to. No shit, dude. Right? Right? Nothing changes. Here's what he says, the thing about Gatsby and Nixon, and the light is black instead of green. The other thing was, he says on page 108, he says the other offers were kind of interesting, a little more prestigious, but he got a offer from Ballantine Books that was a firm offer. It was a $6,000 advance, and I could get $1,500 just by signing, which is huge back then. It's big now, right? Imagine getting a $6,000 advance for your book now. That's huge. I mean, but think of it then. He says, I would have signed anything at the time. I'd have signed a contract to write a book about hammerhead sharks, go out in the bay and swim with the bastards. Of course, I'd already written 2 novels. I'd always regarded journalism as a lower form of work, a left-handed thing to make money. Left-hand path. But of course, I'd never seen any journalism that struck me as being special. It was all the same, newspaper writing. He says, but the subject was so strange for the first time in any kind of journalism, I could have the kind of fun with writing that I had in the past with fiction. I could bring the same kind of intensity and have the same kind of involvement with what I was writing about, because there were characters so weird I couldn't even make them up. I'd never seen people this strange, talking about the Hells Angels. In a way, it was like having a novel handed to you with the characters already developed. That happened to me again 8 years later when I got into national politics. But until the Angels, I'd always been writing in the same mold as other newspaper hacks, and I thought that was the way to do it. With the Angels, however, there was a freedom to use words. I'm a word freak. I like words. I've always compared writing to music. That's the way I feel about good paragraphs. When it really works, it's like music. In sports writing, you have the freedom to use really aggressive words. There's a whole breadth of vocabulary. The Angels gave me that same feeling, like hot damn, the thing was rolling right in front of you. You could touch them on their cycles. You could hear them. You could see the fear and fright in the citizens' faces. So he took that $1,500 and he went out and bought a motorcycle, right? So that passage really, like, I love that passage because that's what writing is, right? That's what reading is. That's what writing is. That's what thinking. We've talked about, why words are important. We did that in the last stream, right? We communicate, we think in words. Everything's according to words. So if you're going to be a writer, you have to be a word freak, right? Now I want to skip to something a little different and read this excerpt called Vegas Witchcraft. This is what you guys are going to be here for. Okay. This is from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. All right. And so I might as well, it's a short passage. I might as well just read. Do you guys want me to just read most of it? I'm not here to just I know it's not story time, me reading, just reading the book to you. But I think that it might do us well just to refresh. If you've never heard this, it'll be good. And if you have heard it, this will be a good refresher. This is the key passage from Fear and Loathing, talking about, there's the one passage talking about Arduino, right? Arduino Cuomo. Listen, I can't. Mersh does the best Cuomo impression, right? Shouts out ROTC. All right. Vegas Witchcraft, page 137. Here we go. My attorney was downstairs talking to a sporty looking cop about 40 whose plastic name tag said he was the DA from someplace in Georgia. I'm a whiskey man myself, he was saying. We don't have much problem with drugs down where I come from. You will, said my attorney. Now, this is the attorney, Oscar Zeta Acosta, who is also known as Dr. Gonzo in Fear and Loathing. Of course, Hunter S. Thompson's character is Raul Duke. Oscar Zeta Acosta was a real Chicano civil rights lawyer in I guess in LA in the 60s. Wore that one black glove. I have a theory that he was also something else because of what he says about him in the what he quotes Dr. Gonzo is saying and who he defends in the book. I think he was also something else, but let's just see what he says here. You will, said my attorney. One of these nights you'll wake up and find a junkie tearing your bedroom apart. No, said the Georgia man. Not down in my parts. I joined them in page 138. I joined them in order to tall glass of rum with ice. You're another one of these California boys, he said. Your friend here's been telling me about dope fiends. They're everywhere, I said. Nobody's safe, and sure as hell not in the South. They like the warm weather. They work in pairs, said my attorney, sometimes in gangs. They'll climb right into the bedroom and sit on your chest with big Bowie knives. He nodded solemnly. They might even sit on your wife's chest, put the blade right down on her throat. Jesus God Almighty, said the Southerner. What the hell's going on in this country? You never believe it, said my attorney. In L.A., it's out of control. First it was drugs. Now it's witchcraft. Witchcraft? Shit, you can't mean it. Read the newspapers, I said. Man, you don't know trouble until you have to face down a bunch of these addicts going crazy for human sacrifice. No, he said, that's science fiction stuff. Not where we operate, said my attorney. Hell, in Malibu alone, these damn Satan worshipers kill 6 or 8 people every day. He paused to sip his drink, and all they want is the blood. They'll take people right off the street if they have to. He nodded. Hell yes. Just the other day, we had a case where they grabbed a girl right out of a McDonald's hamburger stand. She was a waitress, about 16 years old, with a lot of people watching too. What happened, said our friend. What did they do to her? He seemed very agitated by what he was hearing. Do, said my attorney. They chopped her damn head off right there in the parking lot. Then they cut all kinds of holes in her and sucked out the blood. God Almighty, the Georgia man exclaimed, and nobody did anything? What could they do, I said. The guy that took the head was about 6'7" and maybe 300 pounds. He was packing 2 Lugers, and the others had M16s. They were all veterans. The big guy used to be a major in the Marines, said my attorney. We know where he lives, but we can't get near the house. No, our friend shouted, not a major. He wanted the pineal gland, I said. That's how he got so big. When he quit the Marines, he was just a little guy. That's horrible. So I think that's probably, let me skip a little bit. He says, the bartender seemed to stiffen, but our Georgia friend didn't notice. His mind was somewhere else. Hell, I really hate to hear this, he said, because everything that happens in California seems to get down our way sooner or later. Ain't that the truth, right? Mostly Atlanta, but I guess that was back when the damn bastards were peaceful. It used to be that all we had to do was keep them under surveillance. They didn't roam around much. But now, Jesus, nobody's safe. They could turn up anywhere. You're right, said my attorney. We learned that in California. You remember where Manson turned up, don't you? Right out here in the middle of Death Valley. He had a whole army of sex fiends here. We only got our hands on a few. Most of the crew got away, just ran off across the sand dunes like big lizards. and every one of them stark naked except for the weapons. And then on page 140, the only way to do it is to take the bull by the horns, go to the mat with the scum. What do you mean by that? You know what I mean. We've done it before, and we can damn well do it again. Cut their damn heads off, every one of them. That's what we're doing in California. I nodded. My attorney was already gone, scurrying through a maze of slot machines toward the front door. I said goodbye to our friend, warning him not to say anything about what we told him. Now look, what do you think about that? Okay, because you read this and you think this is like a mescaline. By the way, it mentions DMT in here, which is weird, right? Writing in the 70s. You think he's writing a mescaline, acid drenched DMT satirical story to freak out the squares. However, it's a pretty specific story. And when we take that in light of the Phoenix program, where's my Phoenix program book? Where's my Phoenix program book? Where is it? Oh, when you take that in light of everything that's mentioned in the Phoenix program, right? Especially with vets and the actual stories of what Lansdale got the people to do with the puncturing the guys on the trail, right? In order to freak them out as a hardcore psychological operation, combined with this book right here, Fatal Vision. This is an actual case, right? This was the Green Beret guy at Fort Bragg who claimed the exact things that we just read. And one of the consultants on this was Ted Gunderson, right? Who Franklin Scandal and Conspiracy of Silence seems to corroborate all of those actual events. So take that how you will, guys. But that's one of those things that's used all of the time, right? In the literature and the viewing material that we see about these sick people. So I'm just going to leave that where it is, right? Let's see. I'm going to move on to, but I just wanted to read that because that's one of the passages, right? That's where let me check out the super chats before I move on. Shouts out to everybody out there. Hope everybody's having an awesome night. Thank you for being here with me on a weeknight. Sweet. $5 from Adam. Thank you so much. Thank you for that awesome donation. I really appreciate you. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. Yo, Steven says $10 on PayPal. Thank you so much, homeboy. Really appreciate you. Thank you so much. And who's this? Maddie? Maddie sends me $5. Let's see. Just sent you a question in your IG DMs. Okay, let me check my IG DMs. Let's see. That's the real Cooter Brown. He says, I'm going to read this. Okay, is that cool if I read it? One thing I've always found odd is how little is known about Hunter S. Thompson's early life. With most major authors, we know a good bit about their early life, but with him, it's like he was born, his father passed away, and then he got arrested right before high school graduation. Any thoughts on that? Yeah, actually, there is quite a bit about Hunter S. Thompson's early life, and a lot of it is in this book right here. Now, this is his biography, and you could say that this is kind of a fake biography, but there is quite a bit about his early life in this book by E. Jean Carroll, and basically talks about him growing up. It talks about his high school shenanigans. It talks about his some of his dating life, his sports life. What he did with he would prank people. And then him going off after high school. So there is quite a bit about that. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think all I remember from reading this book is that my impression was that he was a liar, of course, yes. But I think that my impression of Hunter S. Thompson is that he grew up, in the 30s, 40s, and early 50s in a conventional, as far as I know, in a conventional household, well-to-do. He came from a good, he came from a normal, good family. Because not everyone is, of course, not everyone is, goes through horrible situations, is traumatized, and gets into this. Some people are absolutely normal, right? Into the things that we think that he was into. And then he went on to get into journalism. So I've always kind of thought about his life in terms of like, I always sometimes confuse in my head Hunter S. Thompson and Henry Miller. They're nothing really alike, except for the fact they kind of look alike. And Henry Miller grew up, in a tenement in the like early 20th century in the Bronx, no, in Brooklyn. But yeah, I think Hunter S. Thompson grew up in a pretty conventional life, country clubs and tennis playing, and then went on to do the things that he did. That would also kind of account for, his ability to be able to afford to sustain himself. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Real Cooter Brown. Appreciate you. Let's see what else. Somebody else just dropped. Kristen at Slow Boy Whiteboard drops $5, and I really appreciate you as always, Kristen. Thank you so much. You are the best. Oh, here's TGF. Also, I missed that. TGF also drops $20. Hey, thank you, Green Feathers. Really appreciate you. Yeah, Green Feathers. Everybody go to Green Feathers and check out his artwork and his painting. Check out, of course, Slow Boy Whiteboard. I'm always watching your videos, of course, all day, every day. Right? Take the DARPA pill. So thank you so much. Let's see. Listen to the talk, or Doc Holliday says, I'm your Huckleberry. Play for blood, remember? Why, that's just my game. In vino veritas. Age quadragis. Nope, I knew it. Now I really hate him. I got 2 guns, one for each of you. Poor man. The man was just too high strung. All right, I'm just going to quote the whole movie. Listen to Talk Over Track of Fear and Loathing on the Criterion Collection DVD. He's fully demon-possessed and screaming the entire time. He confesses most of everything and dies a few weeks later. Yeah, I've got the Criterion Collection DVD in there, and I've got the documentaries that Hunter S. Thompson did. When I lived in the UK, they would always show documentaries. They would show like the Channel 4 documentary that they did with him and Ralph Steadman. And in fact, it's good you bring that up there, Doc Holliday. There is a... I remember, you guys remember when he died? I remember when he died in 2005, mostly because like at the time I was like, it's kind of like Elliott Smith. Like when Elliott Smith died, it was right at the height of when I was listening to Elliott Smith all the time. And then same with Hunter S. Thompson. Like I had just read The Great Shark Hunt, and then he died in 2005. And then I remember reading the article in Rolling Stone. Of course, there's a lot of weird stuff about his death. That, I don't know what to think about that. I'm sure the official story is probably not it. I remember at the time that he had back surgery and that he was on a lot of Oxycontin and stuff, and that he wasn't writing and doing a lot of output. And then, he made that statement to, I think, Steadman that, if there was a time when he wasn't able to off himself, then he would feel restricted or whatever. And that I think he wanted to do an Ernest Hemingway. But then again, that's kind of like, okay, is that the normie narrative? What really happened? I think that there is some thought about things that he was privy to and that information that he had, and that, things were starting to come out or whatever. And maybe that had happened, but he was 67 at the time. Who knows? But there is a passage in here dealing with what you just said there, Doc Holliday, which is a letter from his landlord. Which he put in here. Now, again, this is like this double life. We could say, okay, is this just his mayhem? Is this just his reputation? Or is this actually the truth? And he says, let's see, hold on. There's all these press releases in here, especially relating to his court case. his arrest warrant and charges. Let's see. He says, I don't know. Maybe I'm not going to be able to find it. It's at the end here somewhere. Okay, so I'll just summarize it basically before I take any more time with that. It's basically a letter from his landlord to him, and it says, "We've received complaints about your house." I mean, he was always getting complaints, but he did live on a gigantic spread of land. That all we hear is constant screaming, and the sound of it sounds like somebody being GANGRAPED all the time, constant screaming and agony, and that this serves as our notice. Our tenants are now moving out of the house because they can't stand it anymore. And that's like his neighbors. Then he puts that into the book, right? Very odd. And that's more than just like playing music all the time. That's like demonic behavior. There's also the interview. You can watch the, I don't know if somebody's mentioned this in chat, but you can watch the Hunter Thompson interview with Letterman. Do you remember that interview? Very strange, very bizarre. Even for like being on Letterman, that was very bizarre because he talks about the most dangerous game again, right? It's always the most dangerous game. And he says like, oh no, we can't hunt animals anymore. You know, the best thing to hunt's a human being is what he says. Yeah, the thing about with Jack Nicholson. Well, one of the things with Jack Nicholson, he puts Jack Nicholson on his honor roll in here. And he says that there's this thing called the Woody Creek Hunt Club. And it includes prestigious members, including Jack Nicholson, Don Trump, and a bunch of other people. And that it says like, well, let me find this. There's so much in here. Let's see. It says they reserve the right to anybody who breaks the silence of their hunt club deserves to be met with the full brunt of what they're capable of in the hunt club, which is very odd. Okay. Now, again, some people will read this and say, this is pure satire. This is pure character building, right? Building his own legend in his lifetime. And, he was certainly like this maniacal character who, did mayhem. And I get that. I get that people say that. I think that could be valid, right? But there is a lot of other stuff in here that goes way beyond that. And so I'm just, I'm very suspicious. Like, once you sort of walk through the looking glass with this stuff, it's very hard to turn a blind eye to some of the things the allegations that he makes about himself. He says, for instance, he says on page 269, this is from I Knew the Bride When She Used to Rock and Roll. He ran away with he talks about he was in a political bar, and this woman comes down and he thinks that he makes a joke about, is she being GANGR roiped? Right. And then he like makes this joke like, oh, he's in the mood for that. Right. And then this woman comes to him and she says, can you take me away from here? And he takes her and they like get in his Jeep and they drive away. And she is the wife of like a senator. Okay. And he realizes driving away that like, oh, this could be bad because, they're going to be looking for me. But then she wants to go to Reno and get married. And then he talks about on page 270, he says, it is a baleful vision, despite Boa, I don't know who that is, status as a guru to the financial community, but it's no less baleful than the new wave of rigid boy in the bubble zeal that is sweeping the nation today. He's talking about the 80s and 90s. The fallout is all around us in the form of rubbers, reformers, and overcrowded jails, but it can be a very nasty tide to go against. The body Nazis are out there, and even the preachers in prison for compound SODOMY and C ROIP, CHILD ROIP, are compiling lists of names. Why is that fucking something you put in here? Then he says Keith Richards has confessed that he was a total junkie living from one fix to the next when Exile on Main Street was recorded. And that album has more great loud and dirty rock and roll on it than any dozen recordings by people who could pass blood tests. Well, yeah, I've got the book Exile on Main Street right there, right here. Exile on Main Street, about the recording of Exile on Main Street, right? It was recorded in a former SS torture facility in Nice, in France. And I say they chose it purposefully, and they were getting their pink tie heroin from the Marseille mafia. And one of the guys that they were getting it from was that Count, who was the dealer who sold to Jim Morrison at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus Club in Paris that ended up killing him, right? And it's interesting. He talks about, oh, you need to be all, messed up or whatever to create this stuff. When, I mean, even William Burroughs talks about, he says he could never create when he was, on drugs and all that. Instead, he went to Tangier and he would do that. And he ended up staring at his toe for 9 hours. Right. Even William Burroughs says that. Says the world is full of people who claim they used to party with the likes of Janis, Jim Morrison, the Stones, or John Belushi, or even me. They roam the chic anterooms of movies and music and publishing like vengeful golems from some lost and broken Peter Pan world of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and other unspeakable tragedies that crippled the lives and crazed the souls of so many. Yes, so many. Indeed, we were all snapped like matchsticks in that terrible conflagration. And the unexplainable few who survived somehow are now like the victims of some drunken golfing foursome that got so wiggy and disgusting by the time they finished the first 9 that God sent a lightning bolt down from the black cloudy heavens to hit them like a bomb while they gambled like maddened sheep on the big wet green on number 16. That reminds me of the Judge from Blood Meridian, you guys. Their flesh and their brains and their precious bodily organs were burned to cinders and black chalk skeletons that will never again have real strength. They will walk in the world forever like some strung out collection of Ming vases that might crack at any time they are touched. That's quite a statement on the world, right? Then he talks about Aspen, and he says spring in the Rockies is an ugly time. Again, another T.S. Eliot reference, right? April is the cruelest month. Breeding lilacs out of the dead land, stirring dull roots with spring rain, mixing memory and desire. Intertextuality again, page 212. He mentions G. Gordon Liddy. He says he's being followed by another political operative from the White House. The White House has sent somebody to follow him. In the good old days, I might have thought it was Gordon Liddy, just running one of his capers. But Gordon doesn't work for the White House anymore. We just read Will, right, by G. Gordon Liddy. Okay, one more thing is I wanted to read here is, let's see. I've got 2 more things to read. One is on page 184, and that's his talk about what Gonzo journalism is and kind of its reversal. And the last one is about how the counterculture becomes the establishment, or whether it always was in the first place. He says, what I'd like to know now is if Gonzo journalism is essentially the art or compulsion of imposing a novelistic form on journalistic content, then the next logical step in the Gonzo process would seem to be a 180-degree reversal of that process by writing a journalistic novel, which is bullshit, of course, because on the high end, there's only one real difference between the two forms, and that is the rigidly vested interest in the maintenance of a polar or strictly polarized separation of fiction and journalism by at least 2 generations of New York anchored writers who spent most of their working lives learning, practicing, and finally insisting on the aesthetic validity of that separation. And what the hell, he says, I suspect it's generally important to them, so why not concede to it? 10 years from now, I might feel in a mood to force that kind of merger. But for now, the formal separation works in my favor because it gives me a straw man to beat on and stir the buggers up. Just for the record, however, and one of these days, I hope to find enough time to explain this notion properly. The only real difference between journalism and fiction, in my own mind, is legalistic. With our contemporary standard-based journalism as nothing more than a sloppy lay extension of the rules of evidence rooted in the adversary relationship that governs our 20th century American trial procedure. And the best and highest kind of contemporary fiction or even high novelistic journalism, with its roots in thinking of those essentially Jeffersonian pragmatists often referred to by historians as the great Stoic lawyers of ancient Rome. He says, the only point I wanted to make was that, by conceding what I consider a false distinction between journalism and fiction. That's pretty revelatory, right? Right. So what he's saying is that, in the mind of the Gonzo journalist, you're essentially you're blurring the lines between the journalist and the novelist, right? Which is essentially where his sense of satire comes from, because he can get at the truth of the situation rather than the object of the reporting, right? But what he's saying here is that journalism, in terms of, the American experience, is rooted in the adversary relationship between, the free press and its criticism of the government. But obviously there is no distinction, right? At least anymore, that there is no adversarial relationship. That's just a cutout or a limited hangout. It essentially, the journalistic adversary works for the same interests that the people they're criticizing work for, right? That's what the church hearings brought out. That's for sure. That's what the Mockingbird, that's what Operation Mockingbird is, that essentially there is no difference. And what he's saying here is that, that Gonzo journalism is supposed to merge and also make a distinction in those two. But what it ends up doing is turning it on its head and just showing a further proof that there is no distinction between the two. Does that make sense? And then I think that on page 189, this is where he talks about the counterculture and the establishment. He says, at least one person has suggested that we may be looking at the last refuge of the liberal mind, or at least the last thing that works. The liberal mind meaning the liberal, the Enlightenment liberal mind, right? He says, this is when Reagan was president. He says, run for your life, sport, because that's all you have left. The same people who burned their draft cards in the 60s and got lost in the 70s are now into running. So true. That's, again, with all of these books, there is a revelation in the method, or at least there's a revelatory process of truth, these small glimpses of truth that we get from them, right? So what he's saying is that the same people who were in the counterculture in the 60s are the same ones that, created the Apple computer, right? They're the same ones that manage the establishment that runs it now. When politics failed and personal relationships became unmanageable after McGovern went down and Nixon exploded right in front of our eyes, after Ted Kennedy got Stassionized and Jimmy Carter put the fork to everybody who ever believed anything he said about anything at all, and after the nation turned en masse to the atavistic wisdom of Ronald Reagan. Well, these are, after all, the 80s, and the time has finally come to see who has teeth and who doesn't, which may or may not account for the odd spectacle of two generations of political activists and social anarchists finally turning 20 years later into runners. In other words, these counterculture people just become establishment and they run for office, right? So the other thing, the last thing, which I'll just summarize, is he's talking about how in the middle of the night, he's watching he says he's watching some fat people work out in spandex on TV, and basically there's just nothing going on. He's watching the football scores or whatever. And then all of a sudden it breaks that the Marines are in a firefight with some unknown enemy at the airport in Lebanon. And that the embassy's been bombed in Lebanon. And he says that this serves, he reflects on it, and first he fires off a memo, and he puts it on the Mojo. He calls it the Mojo machine, which is essentially like, I guess, the teletype machine. And he sends it off to his his publishers or his editors or whatever. And he says a couple of things. He says he tries to get this in before everybody else, but he has to wait long enough to make sure that at least one person in the MSM will agree with him, because he says there's nothing worse as a political journalist than giving an opinion that nobody else agrees with. Well, that right there is what Kristen was just saying, right? The guy's a liar. He doesn't care about truth, right? He doesn't care about saying the truth for truth's sake. He cares about whether it's corroborated and supported by other people with the same agenda. And he says that he can't make, basically he comes to the conclusion, like, he can't make heads or tails of it. He doesn't know what's happening because Nam is over, right? And I remember this is like the 80s, and they're getting up towards the end of the Cold War era, which we've seen so much of in the globalist book series and the writings of the elite and all this stuff, the grand chessboard, right? The Cold War era is coming to an end, and this is a precursor to the war on terror. And he says, he ends up talking to another journalist, and he says, I bet you anything, and this is pretty revelatory again. He presages the war on terror, and he says, I bet you anything, somehow this is going to relate back to that guy Gaddafi. Even if not literally so, even if it's not Gaddafi who did it, they're going to blame him because he's been asking for it. And why do we know he's been asking for it? Because, he denied the IMF loans and all this stuff. And he says that guy's been in the thorn in the side of the administration for a long time, and it's going to get back to him. And that's exactly what happened. Now, he wasn't blamed for that. But remember, he was blamed for the LOC, well, I just said the Lockerbie, BOMBING later, right? He's blamed for all that stuff. And then eventually that culminates in extremists, right? With we came, we saw, he died, right? And then the propaganda film to justify that whole thing with the Michael Bay 13 Hours, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting. Another thing he says is that if he talks about, he mentions George Romney a lot, and you remember George Romney versus, in the Nixon era, but then he's talking about, this is before he gets to Dukakis and Bush. He's talking about maybe it's Muskie, I guess, running against, did he run against Reagan? Well, anyway, whoever it is with Reagan. And he says, when that happened, that served to solidify the second half of the Reagan administration, because there's one thing that the power structure can always rely on for continuity of power, and that is a major military event. He says that if there's one thing that that the U.S. military will do, he says people around the world know not to fuck with American embassies, right? Because he says they will absolutely annihilate them and the next country over. He talks about he's one of the reasons he ends up quitting, or not quitting. One of the reasons he ends up finally not believing in Rolling Stone, for example, is he gets hired by Rolling Stone to do a piece in Saigon. So he flies over to Vietnam. And as he's on the plane flying over to Vietnam, he finds out that he's been fired because they filed for bankruptcy. So then he gets over there, and then he ends up either he goes to Laos or he writes about Laos, and he quotes MacArthur and basically says, like, the people in Laos don't give a shit about anything global. They just care about like their families and having enough food on the table and like their little community. And he says that obviously as a criticism of communism, but we know that this is also applies to the entire globalist agenda, the communist capitalist, the entire globalist agenda. And what ends up happening is Saigon messes with the Americans, and they are bombed, and then Laos is bombed. Same happens in Lebanon. Same happens in just give us an excuse, basically, right? Look at the Middle East for the last 20 years. So he says that this will serve to solidify power, and it's multifold, right? It's and this is like ripe ground for fake FLAGS operations, because this will serve as a continuity of power. But it's interesting that he brings that up, especially in light of, he's a pure lefty, right? That's what he is, admittedly so. But it's revelatory for the entire system and the entire sort of the context of the entire operation. So I know I've kind of been running on and babbling with that, and I hope that makes sense to people. You may be watching that and thinking that I'm just babbling. I don't, maybe you're like, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Rachel says she's literally falling asleep. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm sorry. I'm gonna try to keep you up a little better. Dang. Rachel, I hope you had a good trip. Kristen's falling asleep too. Yeah, well, you know what, you guys, thank you for being here on a weekday night and chilling with me, talking about Hunter S. Thompson. Okay, listen, if you don't want me to put you to sleep, you guys, help me get up to 1,000 subs, and then we're gonna have a based party. Okay, where all I'm gonna do is dumbass impressions and sing songs and try to make you guys laugh. Maybe I'll even do my rap song. Maybe I'll even do my cringe rap here live on the stream. Okay, I did it on Instagram, but I'll do it with a little more effort and a little more verve for you. But yeah, if you want to see me, if you want me to make you laugh with some dumbass impressions or whatever, you guys hit me up with some more super chats. Hit me up with some more cash apps or whatever, you guys, because I can really use it. Of course, I'm going through my books here. I really I've decided also one of the other books I'm going to do in the future is Don DeLeo's Underworld. I need to get a copy of that. It's this massive tome. But I've been I'm not, of course, I love doing this anyway, right? I'm going to keep doing it. But, I've really been rolling through these books. We've done some good streams, and, I rolled through this one in one day. So, I'm just going to keep going through the books. Thank you to everybody who suggested works. I'm still going to do, I'm going to do Don Quixote. Need to do that one. We need to do King Lear. We've, I got to say, we've made some really good choices for the content in terms of the books that we've covered on here, because every book that we do relates to the next book, right? He quotes Moby Dick, Great Gatsby, a bunch of other books in this one. And, we did our movie analysis stream the other night. Let me know. Yes, Mr. Knight says, yes, more classics, less modern. Yeah, I'll go back to some of the classics. I thought I would just do modern because, it's relevant now, and because that's where my sort of whim took me. And we've been doing some modern books now for a while, so we do need to go back to the classics. One book that we need to cover, obviously, is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I can't believe we haven't covered that yet, but we've got all the time in the world to cover that. But I think I'll get on that one next. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because of obvious DID. We did that with Frankenstein, etc. We need to do. What else do we need to do? Yeah, it'll be interesting going back and doing Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde because, again, it's one of those books that everybody remembers, or at least they remember the story of, but it's slightly different than you probably remember it. Derek says maybe some more Victorian era stuff. Yeah, it's a good idea. And I don't know if anybody's interested in me I'm going to be doing more poetry in the future, but we could go back and do more lyric poems, more verse, or at least fit those into other streams. We started with those. That was a good start. I was thinking of doing Virgil's Aeneid because we've done Dante's Inferno. Jethro wants to do Apocalypse Now. Joseph Conrad. We definitely need to do that, you guys. I've got the screenplay for Apocalypse Now in there, and I've got Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Yeah, we definitely need to do that. What else do we need to do? Crispy says we're going to do the Art of the Deal. It's going to be something really special. It's going to be really well. Stephen Vincent Benet, I was just going through my books up here, and I've actually got, I don't know if I showed you guys this. I've got an early, hold on, let me stand up. Hold on a second. I've got right up here. This might interest you. Look at this. Speaking of Binet, check this out. The Magic of Poetry and the Poet's Art by Vincent Binet. Look at this book. This is by F.E. Compton and Company. And this is copyright 1936, first and only edition of this. Look at this book. That's pretty cool, right? So that's a rare book. Yeah, we should do the Odyssey. We could do Edith Hamilton's mythology. That would be a great one to cover, right? We could do at least pick out some of mythology. We could do. I've got Ovid. Let's see. We could do Ovid's Metamorphosis, right, for mythology. We could do. We've done Oedipus Rex. We could probably do a picture of Dorian Gray. I just recently reread that. And also, what we need to do is cover some music books, right? We should cover, we could cover No One Here Gets Out Alive or Hammer of the Gods, Led Zeppelin. I don't know. It depends on whether you guys want to cover that or not. So those are like music. We haven't really gone into music literature at all or music biographies. That would be cool. We also, we also haven't gone into, Arthurian literature, and you can't really see it, but over there, I've got the whole 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 or 5 shelves is just Arthurian literature. So we could cover that. We could cover Le Morte d'Arthur and all of the ancient, I've got Parzival, Lancelot du Lac, all of the Grail literature. I don't think we covered Dorian Gray. We've talked about Dorian Gray, but I don't think we've covered it. I don't think. Maybe we have. But I just recently reread it. And it's essentially the same. It's, I think we talked about it when we discussed Frankenstein. And certainly a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde-esque book. So, yeah, let me know what you guys want me to cover. Just leave me some comments below. Don't forget, you can email me at madmaximalism@gmail.com with 2 X's. Madmaximalism, all one word, at Gmail, 2 X's. And let me know what you think. Please don't forget to leave me a comment. Please don't forget to share my streams. And if you're not following me on Instagram yet, follow me over there. And that's about it, you guys. That's about all I got. What'd you guys think of that? I kind of, I should clarify, I'm not falling asleep because 50, yes, Rachel, I know, Rachel, you're my homegirl and you are the queen. So, I knew that very well, but I hope your trip went well. I love the pictures. Shout out to Rachel. Shout out to Andy BPF. Shout out to, David Patrick Harry. It looks like you guys had fun in Montana. Wow, long drive. Hope everybody's having a really good summer. I don't know about y'all. I know we're small talking now, but I keep seeing the stories of it's 200 degrees or whatever everywhere else. Luckily here, it's been like in the 70s and stuff, so that's cool. But I'm sure it'll get hot and humid as hell coming up. I'm still looking forward to seeing, as soon as I can catch this Alex Garland movie. It's called Men, MEN, and it's by Alex Garland, right? Of course, who did Annihilation and Devs. We just talked about Devs, and he did The Beach, right? He wrote The Beach. It was directed by Jethro, who pointed this movie out to me as well. You guys, thank you so much for being here. Shouts out to everybody. Thanks again to everybody who supported me tonight. Real Cooter Brown. Let's see. Who else? Adam. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you for supporting me. If you want to support me, don't forget. Thank you so much. Peace, and I'll see you on the next stream. Okay. Thanks, y'all. Appreciate you. Love you. Peace.